was said of well-known Bible teacher Charles Spurgeon that he could often be seen walking to the pulpit with a Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. And that's a good metaphor for what we're going to discuss today, Christianity and culture. And I think we do have to understand something of our times to effectively engage with the unchanging truth. So how can we effectively engage with culture? I spend a lot of time researching societies, communities, trying to take the pulse, if you like, to see what they think and the views, perspectives, attitudes, and what their values are. We've just finished a recent study across Australia called Faith and Belief in Australia, and there's a full report and an infographic on that, just looking at the heart and soul, the mind and mood of this particular nation. And what we found is that, well, it's quite similar to what we see in the US and New Zealand and other countries as well. In fact, the full report is freely accessible on that particular URL. We've also just last month finished one across New Zealand as well. The same methodology, and there's a full report and infographic on the New Zealand Faith and Belief as well, and you can access that from that site as well. But what was fascinating as we surveyed these nations is to find that we are, from a cultural or social perspective, living in times of great change. Now, every society has had to deal with change, but the changes in these particular times, in this 21st century, when you look at the generational change, the social change, the technological change, economic shifts, demographic transformations, it's change that probably looks a little bit more like that. The speed of the change, the scale of it, the extent of the trends that we see these days, the global nature of them, truly is transforming the context in which we minister and engage. In fact, I began a report recently by saying that it's only occasionally in history that massive demographic shifts, combined with rapid social change and huge generational transitions and ongoing technology trends, so that within the span of a few decades, society altogether alters. And that's a pretty apt description of these particular times, of these recent decades in which we have lived. And I guess the question for us is, well, why do we need to understand our times? Shouldn't we just understand the word and effectively communicate that clearly? Well, of course we should, but to understand the context into which we speak is important as well. I mean, this was Paul's approach when he was writing to the church at Colossae. He got to chapter 4 and he was putting together his prayer list for them. And he said, and pray for us too, that God may open a door for our message so that we may proclaim the mystery of Christ, for which I am in chains. And he added another prayer to the list. And he said, and pray that I may proclaim it clearly as I should. And so you can see his approach. Pray that God may open the door. Pray that I may proclaim it clearly. That God will and that I may. There's divine sovereignty. There's human responsibility to take full advantage of the opportunities God presents. And I think we can proclaim it clearly as we should by not only understanding the message, but by knowing something of the context, the culture, the times. So let's have a quick look at that from a Western perspective. What's happening in these developed nations? And I'll use Australia as a key reference point because that's the culture in which I'm planted, but it's true right across the Western world. We're living in times of massive demographic change, indeed demographic growth. Australia is just closing in on the 25 million mark in a world of 7.6 billion. What's amazing is that in the lifespan of more than half of the population in Australia and indeed the planet, you go back to 1970, and Australia was half what it currently is at 12.5 million. The world was half what it currently is at 3.7 billion. In other words, in most people's lifetime, the population of, well, our nation here in Australia has doubled and the population of the world has doubled. It's fast growth that we see globally and nationally as well. We're seeing, therefore, not only population growth, but urbanization trends. And this we see around the developing world, look across Asia, look across Africa, but we see in the Western world as well. Infill, densification, the rise of the vertical communities, not just the horizontal ones. In other words, it's a world not just of detached homes, but increasingly the apartment and townhouse living. In Australia, we've been famous as this land where the Aussie dream is to own your own home with a backyard and a picket fence and your own piece of grass, but that is changing. In fact, 1 in 4 Australians now lives in an apartment or a townhouse, the medium or high density categories. If you look at our largest cities, Sydney and Melbourne, it's almost half of all residents are now living in apartments or townhouses. So our context is changing, our cities are changing, how we connect with an urban, industrialised, densified, cafe culture of today, where people aren't in the suburbs necessarily. It's not just urban sprawl, but indeed it's that walkable community. It's that more urban environment. In fact, in a city like Sydney, the majority of new housing approvals, 2 in 3, are in that apartment or townhouse category. This gives us something of the trends that we're seeing in our major cities, in our global cities. Our population is not only growing and densifying, urbanising, changing, but it's ageing. And this is a theme, again, across the developed world. If we go back 3 decades and look at Australia's population profile, it used to be called the population pyramid for obvious reasons. There were more younger people down the bottom, and as we moved up, fewer older people up the top. And so a lot of ministry was targeted where the bulk were. Sunday schools and youth ministries, that's where the dominance of the population was. If we wind the clock forward 3 decades to today, the pyramid has become more rectangular. In 3 decades' time, there'll actually, in Australia, be more people aged over 60 than aged under 20. So this pyramid slowly becoming inverted. Now, it's an aging population because it's a longer living population. The longevity boom is phenomenal. And that gives great opportunities not only to connect across more age groups, but to engage people in ministry and missions across a wider age range. It's not just targeting young people now, perhaps before they head off to university for a gap year or maybe as they're starting their vocational life, but the mid-lifers and the career changers and the downshifters right across the age spectrums. We see transition points and opportunity to get involved in missions and ministry and volunteer work across our churches. In fact, the church has an older age profile than our community. Here's again the Australian data. Almost 1 in 4 Australians are aged over 60, as you can see, 24%. If you take those who attend church, it's actually almost twice that. 44% of all churchgoers are aged over 60. And so engaging with them, meeting their needs is important, but also connecting with the younger generations so that our churches and ministries are not stuck on an aging trajectory. That is important as well. Changing demographics, generational change is another key theme that we see right across the Western world. There are 6 generations that define us. We probably know the veterans or the seniors. We call them the builders generation because they have been the builders of ministries and of our churches and of our way of life. They continue to build and to volunteer, but they are in those senior years now. It's the baby boomers who have moved into those key leadership roles, the largest demographic in the developed world, part of this post-World War II baby boom that continued through the 1960s. But it's Generation X now that are in their 30s and 40s and moving into those leadership roles, moving through the middle years of their parenting. It's Generation Y, who are the new family formers in their 20s and 30s and key influences in our society. It's Generation Z, who are the children and young people, but who are moving into their 20s and so really starting to make those life decisions. And having worked our way through the alphabet with X and Y and Z, we're not going back to A, we're moving to the Greek alphabet. And so each generation now spanning 15 years, as you can see. The generation from 2010, Generation Alpha. The children of Generation Y, born from 2010 through to 2024. They'll be a very different generation again, and understanding each of these emerging generations is key. We've got to understand the generations if we're to effectively connect with them. What worked for the baby boomers may not work with Generation Z. What was great in the 20th century may not apply in terms of its effectiveness today. So who are they? Generation Z, even some of the labels define them a little bit. They're called the iGen or the Screen Ages, Generation Connected, Digital Integrators. You get the point. That technology has been key in shaping them. It has left fingerprints on them during the formative years. And so how they engage and consume content, how they connect, the shorter timeframes, all has been influenced by the technology that they carry in their pockets. Generation Alpha will be even more like that, because they've only ever known this digital world and this era of glass, the touch screens that are in their pockets, not pen and paper, but as we've said, generation glass that define them. Multimodal, global, of course, in outlook and connectivity. And understanding these emerging generations is important because we know that historically it's the younger generations, the younger age groups that have most responded to the gospel. There's each year in Australia a national church life survey conducted. And I know across America, Barnard does these similar studies looking at churchgoers, and this particular question was of great interest in the results that came out last year. At what age did you first become a Christian? And here are the results in Australia across all the denominations. And you can see a strong leaning towards those younger years, under 5 or 5 to 9 or 10 to 14. More than 4 in 5 churchgoers or believers in Australia made their faith commitment before the age of 20. And so there is an imperative to connect with younger people, to understand them, to bridge the gap, and to share the gospel with them. And this is a responsibility from generation to generation. I love that verse in Psalm 78 that says, "We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power and the wonders he has done, so that the next generation will know them, even the children yet to be born, and they in turn would tell their children. Then they would put their trust in God. We'll keep his commands. We'll follow his ways." We are just the next lineup in many generations charged with the knowledge of God and the gospel to share with others. So understanding the next generation is important if we're to effectively communicate with them. And they do speak in a different language. A sentence came my way recently from a young Gen Z fellow. He said, "Hundo, my work gig is tote slay. The hours are deaf's cray cray, but YOLO." Now, this is not some foreign language, although it is a different dialect of English, as you can see. I had to spend a fair bit of time trying to decipher what all of this means, and everything gets shortened now. It's not totally, it's totes and no probs and whatevs, and that's just how they communicate. YOLO, you only live once, cray cray is crazy. I found out, and sometimes it can take a while for them to get to the point, because what this fellow was trying to say quite simply was, "I like my job." So that's just how they communicate. But you get the point. The technology, the generational shifts, the popular culture has shifted even how they connect and communicate. Another trend or mega change I would look at is the cultural transformations that we see in our societies. We are more culturally diverse than we've ever been. Take Australia as an example. We've got record births at the moment, and people are living longer, as we saw, and yet the natural increase, strong as it is less than half of our population growth. Most of it is coming through net overseas migration. And we see this again right across the developed world. So we're growing through that cultural connection. There's more languages spoken. In Australia, more than 1 in 4 of us was born overseas. Now that is up there, in fact, even slightly higher than you have in the US and Canada. A higher proportion of residents overseas born than we see in New Zealand and the UK. But right across these nations, we're seeing cultural diversity and strong migration numbers. You take a city like Sydney, and more than 1 in 3 local residents here speak a language other than English at home. Across Australia, it's 1 in 5. So a lot of different languages, cultures, and ancestries define us. Cross-cultural ministry, therefore, that missional connection across the cultural and language gaps is not just found by us going overseas, but us going up the street and to the unit block next door. And in fact, we ran some analysis recently. We looked at the white pages, where you find the phone numbers. And the centre of Sydney at the moment is a place called Parramatta. So we picked up the Parramatta white pages and looked up the top 10 most common surnames. Now, no one uses phone books to look up phone numbers anymore, but they're very good sociological tools to look at ancestry, because our surname is strongly linked to our ancestral connection. So we found in the white pages in the centre of Sydney here, now normally you would have Smith, Jones and Williams as the dominant surnames, not anymore. The number 1 surname, Patel. Now there's an Indian connection. Number 2, Lee. There's a connection with China. An Anglo-Smith at number 3, we had Kim from Korea, Singh from India, Chen, Wang, Li and Zhang from China, before we have an Anglo surname as number 10 in terms of Williams. That's the centre of Sydney's population. Where the centre goes, the city goes. Where Sydney goes, Australia goes. It's just emblematic of the cultural diversity that defines us. Now, if we went back 3 decades and looked at the countries of birth of overseas born Australians, they were all European countries. Well, New Zealand was there, as it still is, but the other 4 were European. Today, you've got China, India, Philippines, rounding out the top 5. And so this shift in migration patterns into this nation from Europe of old to Asia currently. And that's actually our part of the world. In fact, I put a little ring around that part of the world. We're all aware of the 1040 window. Well, here's a little red circle around Asia for a moment. Did you know that there are more people on the planet that live inside that circle than live outside it? More than 3.6 billion people. And look at the strategic location Australia has. And New Zealand as well, of course, to the demographic epicenter of the world. And indeed, the emerging economic epicenter as well. Great opportunities. And through our own connections and population, of course, that is the case. KPMG recently ran a study looking at the fastest growing megacities in the world. And here currently are the top 20 cities in the world. This is the summary of their findings. And 10 of the largest 20 cities on the planet currently, again, inside that red circle. But if you look at the fastest growing cities, represented by a thicker blue line, and there are 12 of these fast growing cities out of that 20, 8 out of the 12, 2 and 3, are also in that circle. So Asia is home to half of the world's largest cities, 2/3 of the world's fastest growing cities, and clearly great opportunities to connect. Now, when I look across the Australian landscape, as I'm sure we can do across other countries as well, we see that the nations, the cultures gathered there. And that's a forecast in terms of the opportunities we have and what heaven will be like. Revelation 7 verse 9 says, "After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb." What an opportunity we have in our modern, urban, global cities to connect with people that might be saved and be standing before the throne one day. In fact, with this in mind, this technological, new generation, global connection, I thought I'd put up here what creates great fear amongst a younger generation now. It's not snakes or spiders, it's picking up their electronic device and finding that symbol. If the Wi-Fi gets sketchy, that's a bit of a drama. This one creates a little bit of worry. You have to wait for something to download, although the scariest symbol of all these days is going to be that low battery symbol. It does highlight the technological imperatives of modern life and the connections that we have globally. And so there's been worldview change with generational, cultural and demographic shifts. In this recent study we ran in Australia, we looked at the last decade of census results and the answer to this question, what is your religion? And the trends we've seen towards secularism and away from Christianity, I'm sure we're seeing in Western cities across the globe. If we go back a decade, no religion was the 3rd most common response in the census after Catholic and Anglican. By the time we got 5 years on, no religion had moved to 2nd position, and this most recent data shows us that the most common response on that census form was no religion. And the same has happened across the states and territories of this land. A decade ago, only 2 states or territories had no religion as the number 1 response. 5 years on, most of the states and territories had that, and this last time round, every state and territory, the most common response was no religion. And so the rise in scientism, where science is the dominant worldview, where it's a skepticism, it's a moving away from faith, and clearly a rise in no religion. The census data in Australia showed that Christianity still does dominate. If we add up all of those different denominations, and more than half of the national population on this question ticked Christianity, 52%. But that was quite the decline in 5 years when it was 61%. And so that's the trend line that exists as we saw no religion massively increasing to be 30%. Islam moved to 2nd position. It overtook Buddhism and now at 2.6% in 5 years. Buddhism now 2.4%, other religions combined at 3.8%, and about 1 in 10 people didn't answer that voluntary question in the census. So that gives a bit of a landscape of what's happening in Australia. We dug a bit deeper because the problem with some of these national statistical analyses is that it thinks in terms of religion as a structured approach rather than a lot of people who say, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. I don't connect with any of those, but it doesn't mean I don't believe in anything. I've got a spirituality that defines me. So we wanted to add that in. And so we replicated the census question across Australia from a representative sample. And we asked, in addition to the standard question, the options, we put in spiritual but not religious. And so that we didn't get 1 in 10 not completing, it was a forced response, so everyone completed the study. And here's what we found. Christianity dropped a little bit to 45%, as spiritual but not religious emerged with 14% in that category. No religion increased slightly. Probably some of the people who left the question blank in the census are really part of that no religion perspective. All other religions combined stayed pretty much the same. So it tells us that about 45% of our nation here would in some way identify with Christianity, but the spiritual, not religious, a significant number as well. Interestingly, out of the 45% who say Christianity, only 1 in 3 attend church in any sense of regularity once a month or more, about 15% of our nation. That's how it plays out. Now, it's not to say that Australians are anti-Christian or cold on Christianity. In fact, I would say the opposite. In this study, we took the Engels scale, which looks at someone's journey to faith across these 7 points or markers, and we turned that into a question to identify where Australians are at in their perspective of Christianity. And we found something interesting. You saw that 45% identify their religion as Christianity. Well, 38% of Australians will actually personalise the term and say, I consider myself a Christian. So that's pretty significant there, and obviously strong warmth. Then we've got the statements, I believe in Christianity, although I don't consider myself a Christian. I believe much of Christianity. I believe in the ethics and values of Christianity. Clearly warm statements. That's 1 in 4 in those categories. A neutral statement, I believe in religious freedoms, but I don't want to be involved, about 12%. And then on the cooler side, statements like I have some issues with Christianity, I have strong reservations about Christianity, or I'm passionately opposed to Christianity. In total, those cool responses, about 1 in 4. So it means that 3 in 4 Australians are warm or neutral towards Christian things. We sometimes think we're under siege, that Christianity is really in a strong way on the nose and there's stridency against it. There is from some, but the majority, there's still warmth. So will the Western mindset, will the secular mind respond to spiritual things? Yes, they will. There's a truism in Australia that you don't talk about politics or religion. It's the land of she'll be right and the easygoing, laid-back land. People don't like to get too intense about discussions, but actually that's not the case as much these days. In fact, in this national survey, we found that 55% of Australians talk about spirituality or religion at least occasionally. And that was defined in the census, in our survey, as about once a month or more. So every 12 weeks or so, you've got at least half the population talking these things. In fact, 9% will often. That meant every week or more. 46% occasionally. Now, yes, 45% don't talk religion, but more than half of the nation does. So we asked those non-Christians in the study, well, what would attract you towards exploring Christian things? And the number one response was fascinating. Important for us to know. What will strongly attract a non-Christian to explore Christian things? 16% said, and it was the number one response, seeing people who live out a genuine faith. Number 2 on the list was experiencing a personal trauma or life event. We think that those tough times might drive people away from God. Not at all. They get people to seek God and a purpose in their suffering or trauma. And 12% said stories or testimonies from people who have changed due to their faith. If there is a genuine example of Christianity, if there is someone who's got the story to tell, they might not be able to answer all of the tough questions, they might not be an apologist or a great preacher, they might not have answers there, but they say, I tell you what, here's my story. That testimony and how their life has been changed, this is what it's about. So it's authenticity. I saw a school was advertising their literacy night and trying to encourage people to come and learn more about literacy and spelling. But unfortunately, as you can see, their sign did not have a lot of credibility with quite the spelling error there. A reminder for us to be authentic in how we live and in that witness. So what's the perception that Australians have of Christians? We asked, do you know someone who's a Christian? And these were the results of how many Christians that they know. But 8% said that they didn't even know a single Christian. That's 1.5 million people just in this nation alone. We can't assume that in these nations that have had strong Christian heritage or foundations that everyone knows something of Christianity, because that's no longer the case. But of the 92% who does know someone who's a Christian, and that doesn't mean a born-again believer or church-going Christian, that's just, oh yeah, I think their religion is Christian. If that's the case, we said, well, what's your perception of that person? The top 5 values or characteristics that people had of Christians that they know is that they said they were caring and loving and kind and honest and faithful. I mean, that's pretty good. You know, those Christians are being salt and light, and that's the key witness that exists. Now, they were the top 5. There were some other ones as well, like that they were traditional, judgmental, old-fashioned, opinionated, hypocritical. So not quite 10 out of 10 fantastic things, but you do get the point that strong and positive witness taking place. Well, do modern urban dwellers have a positive view of the church or more of a negative view? And clearly we've seen in our cultures changing perceptions to church and declining attendance at church. We asked this question: how well do Australians know the church locally? 56% said not at all. Now, they live in these communities. They drive past that church, if not on a daily, certainly a regular basis. They're around the things of their local churches, and yet most don't know anything of it. 26% know it slightly or moderately well, 18%, 1 in 5, extremely or very well. And then we asked, all right, what's your perception of the impact of the church in your area? Are they positive or are they doing negative things? And 9% were negative towards the churches in their area locally. 47% didn't have an opinion, almost half, because they just didn't know enough about the local churches, but 44% were positive. So for every person that's negative, you've got 5 times as many that have a positive perception of the church. Now keep in mind, only 1 in 5 knew anything solidly of the church, and yet more than 2 in 5 were positive towards the church. So even those who don't know much about church largely have a positive perception of it. So I think we're working in warm terrain, and I think there's the opportunity for the church to be a bit more engaging with our communities and connecting with them. Well, more importantly, what's the perception that urban city-siders have of Jesus? And this came from our study as well. How important was Jesus' life to the history and culture of the world? 14% said not at all important, 33% said slightly or somewhat, but 53% of Australians said extremely or very important. What about to you personally? And the numbers fell off a little bit here. 37% said not at all important to me, 32% said slightly or somewhat, but still almost a third, 31% saying that Jesus Christ is extremely or very important to me personally. So you can see there's still warmth within which we're operating there, with warmth towards Christianity, the church, and particularly Jesus. So we wanted to then test across this landscape how well Australians know something of Jesus. And so we put a multiple choice question to them: in which century did Jesus live? And I was happy to see that 42% got the correct answer, the 1st century AD, although 28% chose the final option, I have no idea. Although I was particularly worried about the 27% of Australians who thought that Jesus lived in ancient times before Christ. So some basic historical illiteracy going on there, as well as some biblical ones. Let me summarise with 4 words in terms of, I guess, some practicalities on engaging in these changing times. I think based on this analysis, we've got to keep it real and authentic in what we say and how we say it. I saw that there were some designers putting together backpacks and they weren't keeping it real because the outcome was a little bit confusing for consumers out there. And I did see this issue on one of the production lines as they were getting cutlery packaged, and unfortunately that made it confusing for consumers as well. And I'm not sure what went wrong with the painting team putting messages on roads, but a few errors there as well. We've got to keep it real in our authenticity, in our communication of truth. We've got to keep it relevant, which means that we do have to adjust and adapt to engage with the changing generations and this changing culture. I saw that there was a boss getting a safety message out to his team. He had a big safety banner printed up, which was great. But unfortunately, his method of attaching the banner, it just didn't quite measure up with the message, and he was not keeping it relevant. The message and his actions just did not integrate. Keep it real, keep it relevant, keep it responsive. We do have to adjust and adapt. We do have to be nimble. I think we've got to be innovative as we communicate and be responsive. I see in the US, there's a sign that gets put up at beaches around water safety, and it's been up for some time because it's not really responded to the changing meaning. Here's the sign. It says, if you see someone drowning, and right in the middle, it's supposed to be a stick figure of someone with their arms raised, but looks a lot like LOL, and to laugh out loud is not the right response. So just a need there to be responsive to the changing meaning, and a reminder for us in that as well. And finally, in addition to keeping it real and relevant and responsive, we've got to maintain the relational nature of it. That's the heart, that's the connection. You saw in terms of evangelism, that's what is the most powerful witness, that authentic relationship. I saw an old management approach that I'm not sure if it ever worked. It certainly won't work these days. Warning to all personnel, firings will continue until morale improves. You can't change someone internally from external force or fear or threats. It's about working within. It's from the heart connection, not just a head connection. It's keeping it relational, real, relevant, and responsive. And I'm sure you're doing that in your ministries and church as well. And may God bless you as you do it.